January 1944. The wind blows like a razor across the plains of Ukraine. The ground is covered in ice and bodies, some human, others frozen horses trapped in the positions they fell days ago. The distant sound of Russian artillery pierces the cold air like metallic thunder. Winter isn't just a weather, it's a living enemy, cruel and patient. The Red Army advances like an endless red tide. T-34 tanks crush the snow under their tracks, cannons roar, and columns of infantry march without stopping. The gigantic Dnieper-Carpathian offensive is in full swing, one of the largest operations on the Eastern Front. Its objective is simple and deadly: expel the Germans from Ukraine and destroy the Wehrmacht's 8th Army. On the other side, German soldiers, exhausted, hungry, dirty, try to hold their positions. Many have gone weeks without proper sleep. Their boots are torn, their feet gangrenous. They no longer fight for glory. They fight only to survive another day. The German divisions, scattered across destroyed villages and frozen fields, they barely have ammunition, fuel, or food. But the radio carries a distant, angry voice from Berlin, in the voice of Adolf Hitler. No retreat, no step back, hold every inch of land. The order sounds like a death sentence. The generals beg permission to retreat and reorganize the lines. Hitler, locked in his heated room, coldly refuses. For him, losing ground is losing honor. But for the men in the trenches, it means dying frozen, alone and forgotten. Around cities like Korsun and Cherkassy, the sky is covered in black smoke. The smell of gunpowder and burning flesh mixes with the freezing air. Explosions light up the night like lightning, revealing dirty faces, wide eyes, and the despair of those who no longer believe in victory. The Soviet troops, buoyed by morale and abundantly supplied, relentlessly pushed back the enemy. Each village captured was a step toward the Wehrmacht's total destruction. The Germans retreat slowly, like a wounded beast, trying to maintain formation as the siege closes in around them. The sounds of the front are deafening: the roar of the guns, the screams of the wounded, the roar of panzer engines trying to break through the hardened snow. And in the midst of it all, the white snow turns red. The steel hell had begun, and no one, not even the most seasoned veterans, imagined what was yet to come. The siege of Cherkassy was about to be born. Documentaries history doesn't show. Subscribe. The ground of Ukraine trembles under the weight of the Soviet advance. January 1944, the Russian offensive is merciless, meticulously planned, and commanded by two of Stalin's greatest military geniuses, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev. They know the enemy is weakened, isolated, out of fuel, and with supply lines cut. Now the time has come to crush the German 8th Army once and for all. The attack begins with a terrifying symphony. Thousands of Soviet guns fire at the same time, vomiting fire and steel over the German positions. The air vibrates as if the ground itself is roaring. Entire trees are ripped from the ground. Shelters are destroyed in seconds. The Wehrmacht soldiers try to protect themselves, but there is no shelter that can withstand such force. Those who survived the initial barrage emerged dazed, covered in mud, snow, and blood. Soon after, the Soviet infantry advances, endless rows of men, followed by columns of T-34 tanks and self-propelled artillery. They don't stop. They don't hesitate. They march over the dead and the wreckage. Meanwhile, the Germans desperately try to maintain contact between their divisions. Roads are blocked. Radio communication is constantly failing, and orders are lost in the chaos. Maps no longer mean anything. What was once the front line is now just a trail of destruction. Within days, Zhukov's forces from the north and Konev's from the south are behind German lines. It's the perfect scam, an immense pincer maneuver. The siege closes around the cities of Korsun and Cherkassy. Within this deadly ring are two entire units of the Wehrmacht, the Agony and Swiss Army Corps, totaling about 56,000 men, Germans, Hungarians, and some auxiliary troops. German radio broadcasts the message no one wanted to hear: "We are surrounded. At the command posts, panic begins to grow. The generals request authorization for an immediate withdrawal. But again, Hitler orders total resistance. He promises that outside forces will break the siege and free them. But the men inside the pocket know that promises don't stop tanks. As the Soviets consolidate their positions, the ring tightens. The sky is constantly covered by smoke from explosions. The remaining Ukrainian villagers hide in basements, praying the bombings will pass quickly. But hell doesn't pass, it just changes shape. The Germans, now surrounded, begin to realize the terrible truth. They are no longer fighting for victory. They are fighting to escape. The Cherkassy Pocket had been born, and with it, one of the bloodiest and most desperate episodes of the entire war. The relentless winter. The siege is formed. The German forces are trapped, and now the real enemy reveals itself. Not only the Red Army, but the Ukrainian winter itself. Temperatures plummet to 25 degrees. The wind cuts like a blade. The snow does not fall softly. She lashes the faces, blinding, burning, freezing everything it touches. Soldiers' boots harden, their clothes become soaked with ice, and their rifles jam in the cold. The Germans dig trenches in the frozen ground, but the ground is so hard that the blades break. Then they use explosives to blast holes in the earth, turning each bomb crater into a makeshift shelter. Inside, they sleep huddled together, shivering, sharing blankets soaked with dried blood and melted snow. Some have their toes blackened by gangrene, others lose their feet completely. The nights are long, without moonlight. An eerie silence broken only by the crack of freezing wood and the howling of the wind. But dawn brings no hope. When the sun rises, it reveals a white field dotted with black and red. Burnt uniforms, tank hulls buried in the ice, bodies piled in postures reminiscent of grotesque sculptures. The Soviets, well equipped and accustomed to the cold, advance without respite. Their tanks move with ease over the frozen terrain, while the German vehicles get stuck or simply won't start. With each Soviet attack, the German positions were pushed further and further into the pocket. In the ranks of the Wehrmacht, morale plummets. Food is running out, bread freezes, rations turn into rock-hard blocks. Many melt snow to drink, risking disease. There are so many injured that field doctors work in open tents, their hands shaking from the cold, sawing off limbs without anesthesia. The dead can no longer be buried. They are left piled up outside the trenches, covered in snow, as if winter were the only gravedigger still on duty. And, even in the face of all this, the voice of the High Command echoes through the radios. Hold on, shelter and reinforcements are on the way. But the surrounded men no longer believe. Each passing day, each freezing night, convinces them otherwise. That was no longer a tactical position. It was a death trap. The soldiers' eyes grow hollow. They know spring may never come for them. And when the wind blows across the battlefield, it carries with it a low, almost human sound. The groan of the army that is slowly freezing to death in Cherkassy. Discover details. The books don't reveal, subscribe. While the men of Cherkassy struggle against cold, hunger and siege, the German generals beg for authorization to retreat. They know that if they stay there, they will be annihilated. But in Berlin, far from the mud, the smoke and the smell of death, Adolf Hitler sees the map of Ukraine not as a battlefield, but as a chessboard of honor and pride. He listens to the reports of losses. Hundreds of tanks destroyed, thousands killed and wounded, and responds in a dry, cold voice. There is no retreat. The position will be held by the last man. It is the same logic that had already doomed his armies at Stalingrad. Now he repeats the mistake. But this time, the men trapped in Cherkassy know exactly what it means. They no longer expect a quick rescue. They wait to die. In the snow-encircled command posts, generals like Wilhelm Stemmermann and Otto Lieb, they try to remain calm in the face of this absurd order. They look into the eyes of their officers and realize that none of them believe in Berlin anymore. But still they obey, not because of faith in Hitler, but because discipline is the only thing that still separates them from madness. In the trenches, News of the order spreads like wildfire. Some soldiers react with bitter silence. Others scream in rage, kick the ice and curse the Führer. "Hold every inch of land," they murmur. With what? With bare hands. Ammunition is running low. Rifles jam from the ice. Radios fail. The eye at Luftwaffe promises to drop supplies, but the weather is terrible, and the boxes fall into Soviet territory almost always. The soldiers look up at the sky, see the planes appearing between the clouds, and pray. But the prayers mix with the sound of explosions. Meanwhile, the Red Army tightened the siege. Zhukov and Konev know that the enemy is dying from the inside out. There is no need to rush. The Soviets control the roads, the rivers, and communications. They surrounded the Germans not only with steel, but with time. Inside the pocket, despair grows every day. The coded messages sent outside speak of a difficult situation, but the internal reports tell the truth. Out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of food, morale is collapsing. And yet the Führer's voice remains firm, echoing through the radio with the tone of an insane prophet. The Wehrmacht does not retreat. The Wehrmacht wins or dies. So they stay, freezing, hungry, surrounded by an enemy that gives no quarter and by a leadership that has abandoned them. Each night, the fire from the explosions paints the sky red, the color of a broken promise and a doomed army. Cherkassy was no longer a battle, era a sacrifice. War stories you've never seen. Click subscribe. The encirclement is complete. The Soviet ring around Cherkassy, Korsun, is a living wall made of steel, fire, and men. Inside, about 56,000 German and Hungarian soldiers are cornered, isolated from the outside world, with no supply line, no consistent air support, and with death approaching in every direction. The divisions of the Kai and 6th Army Corps, composed of hardened veterans and terrified recruits, join forces. Officers, gunners, mechanics, even cooks. Everyone grabs a rifle. There is no more rearguard. There is no more rest. Every man is a fighter. The trenches became mass graves. Soviet artillery fires non-stop, day and night, without mercy. The explosions make the ground shake, tearing up bodies and trees. The shrapnel flies like invisible knives. When the shelling stops, the Russian infantry comes, waves of soldiers screaming, shooting, throwing grenades with an almost animal fury. The Germans respond with everything they have. MG-42s spitting fire, mortars, frozen rifles that fire with a delay. Smoke covers everything. The sounds of screams, explosions, and machine guns blend into a deafening chaos. And when the fight ends, the silence returns, broken only by the groans of the wounded asking for morphine or a mercy shot. Ammunition is starting to run low. The grenades are counted, the cartridges divided among groups of soldiers. Some fight with captured Soviet weapons. Others, when they run out of bullets, they use bayonets, shovels, and even stones. War returns to its most primitive form, man against man, breath against breath. The panzer divisions try to organize counterattacks, but the tanks are almost out of fuel. Some are used as fixed bunkers, buried up to the tower, serving only to fire one last time before being destroyed. Engineers dismantle unused vehicles to extract oil and lubricants, trying to keep the few remaining engines running. In the underground shelters, life is a silent hell. The air is heavy, fetid, a mixture of sweat, blood, and kerosene. The wounded lie side by side, covered by dirty blankets, while surgeons, with trembling hands and dull blades, try to save those who still breathe. The lights flicker. Outside, the distant sound of artillery never ceases, a constant reminder that hell has no exit doors. And yet, there is a dark force that keeps those men standing, the obstinacy of survival. They know they are surrounded, they know they are being slowly crushed, but they also know that surrender means be shot or starve to death in Soviet camps. Then they fight. Every hill, every village, every destroyed barn becomes a battlefield. The Russians advance, the Germans retreat a few meters and counterattack with what little they have. The front becomes a macabre dance. One step forward, two bodies on the ground, and the tighter the siege closes, the more savage the fighting becomes. The soldiers stop thinking about Hitler, Berlin, or the war. Now, they only think about one thing: survive until dawn. But in Ukraine in 1944, dawn brought no light. It brings smoke, blood, and the distant echo of rockets' Katyusha, announcing that the Cherkassy hell is still far from over. The neck Titan's hell now has a shape. The Cherkassy Pocket, this frozen, blood-soaked patch of land, becomes a slaughterhouse. The Red Army, determined to crush the enemy to the last man, closes the siege with iron and fire. Every road, every village, every bridge is taken or bombed into dust. Soviet troops dig in positions in a circle, completely surrounding the Germans. Machine guns, artillery, and T-34 tanks point in all directions. It is an open-air prison where the ground shakes and the air stinks of gunpowder and burning flesh. Cidades como Shandarovka, Stablev et Korsun saw the scene of unparalleled carnage. Entire houses collapse under the impact of artillery. The wreckage becomes makeshift fortifications. Brick walls and piled bodies serve as shelter from the incessant fire. From within the encirclement, Wehrmacht men watch Soviet planes tear through the grey sky. Each dive is followed by explosions that send up columns of snow and blood. The sound is constant, deafening. Those who still have hearing dream of becoming deaf. It would be less painful than hearing the cries of the wounded for help. At night, enemy lines are so close that soldiers can hear each other breathing. Between the breaks in the attacks, there are moments when the wind carries voices in Russian, jeers, orders, laughter. The Germans respond in silence, their eyes blank and their fingers stiff with cold, clutching their rifles as if they were their last anchor of sanity. The Soviets advance with coordinated attacks, pushing the enemy meter by meter. Each village conquered costs hundreds of lives, but the advance continues, unstoppable. The Germans are forced to retreat and concentrate their forces in the center of the pocket. They know the ring is closing. Each day that passes is one less knot in the rope of survival. Ammunition is running low. Fuel reserves are practically depleted. Medical supplies were non-existent. The radios barely work. And when they do, they only bring useless orders from Berlin. Hold on, help is coming. But nobody believes that anymore. They look at the horizon and see only columns of smoke, fires that consume what remains of their defenses. The landscape, once white with snow, is now grey, black and red. Heaps of frozen bodies are used as barricades. The destroyed tanks became shelters. Men sleep among the dead because there, at least, the wind blows less strongly. Katyusha rockets roaring again, the high-pitched rising sound that many call Ochoro de Stalin. And when they fall, the ground opens up as if hell itself emerged. In the midst of this chaos, the German generals begin to realize the inevitable. They are no longer fighting for positions. They are fighting not to be erased from history. But there is still hope. Tenuous, almost illusory. Out of the siege, Marshal Manstein prepares a relief force, and inside the pocket, the trapped men begin to dream of the impossible, break through the Soviet ring and escape the hell of Cherkassy. Witness the battles that changed the world. Subscribe as the siege around Cherkassy, tightened like a noose woven from barbed wire and unrelenting artillery barrages. The trapped German soldiers of the ATAs and Ex-Army Corps, numbering over 50,000 men from divisions like the 57th, 72nd and 88th Infantry, along with remnants of the SS Wiking Panzer Division, found themselves reduced to a primal existence, measuring survival not in days or strategies, but in the fleeting ticks of hours and the dwindling count of bullets in their magazines. The Korsun pocket, as it would come to be known in the annals of the Eastern Front, had shrunk to a ragged ellipse of frozen earth, perhaps 30 kilometers wide at its broadest, hemmed in by the swelling ranks of the Soviet 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts under Generals Konev and Vatutin, whose forces poured in like a crimson tide, their T-34 tanks churning the snow into bloody slush, and their Katyusha rockets screaming overhead like banshees heralding doom. Food rations had evaporated weeks ago, replaced by gnawing hunger that twisted guts into knots. Ammunition was rationed to a handful of rounds per man, forcing them to scavenge from the fallen or resort to bayonets in desperate close-quarters brawls. Medical supplies were a distant memory, with wounds festering under crude bandages torn from the uniforms of the dead. In this hellish cauldron of mid-February 1944, where temperatures plummeted to -20 degrees Celsius and blizzards whipped across the Ukrainian steppe like divine retribution, the only slender thread of hope dangled from the skies above, courtesy of the beleaguered Luftwaffe. Yet even this lifeline proved to be a merciless mirage, a cruel taunt from fate that promised salvation but delivered only deeper despair. The call went out from Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group South headquarters, desperate wires crackling over strained radio lines to Luftflotte 4, demanding aerial resupply to stave off the inevitable collapse of the pocket. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin across a crumbling front from the Baltic to the Black Sea, scrambled what it could. The venerable Junkers Ju-52 transport planes, affectionately dubbed Tante Ju by the crews for their reliability, but now battered by years of war, their corrugated metal skins pockmarked with flak scars. The Heinkel He-111 bombers, repurposed from their original role as medium bombers to makeshift cargo haulers, their twin engines straining under overloaded fuselages, and the lumbering Focke-Wulf FW200 Condors, long-range maritime patrol aircraft pressed into service as heavy lifters, their 4 engines humming with a false promise of endurance. These aircraft, based out of makeshift airfields in Uman and Kirovograd, were loaded in frantic haste under the dim glow of hooded lanterns, crates of 7.19 2mm Mauser rounds stacked alongside jerry cans of precious aviation fuel, tins of ersatz bread and margarine piled next to bundles of bandages and morphine syrettes, all strapped down with ropes that frayed. Under the weight of urgency, the plan, sketched out on dog-eared maps in smoke-filled command tents, seemed straightforward in theory. Fly low over the Dnieper river bend, penetrate the Soviet ring at designated drop zones marked by flares or colored smoke from the ground, release the parachuted containers at 200 meters altitude and wheel away before the enemy could react. But the battlefield was no sterile blueprint. It was a visceral nightmare of white snow stained red with blood, where the abstract lines of logistics dissolved into chaos. The elements conspired against them from the outset, as if the Russian winter itself had allied with the Red Army. Low-hanging clouds, thick as curdled milk, obscured visibility to mere hundreds of meters, forcing pilots to skim the treetops in blind faith, their altimeters spinning wildly as gusts buffeted the aircraft like invisible fists. Snowstorms raged with biblical fury, blanketing the skies in swirling veils that turned day into perpetual twilight, ice accruing on wings and propellers until the planes groaned under the added burden, engines coughing and sputtering as carburetors froze mid-flight. And then there was the Soviet anti-aircraft fire, an infernal symphony of death orchestrated by batteries of 37mm and 85mm guns, their traces arcing upward like glowing serpents, interspersed with the deadly chatter of DSHK heavy machine guns mounted on trucks that prowled the perimeter like wolves. Pilots, many of them young Luftwaffe, lieutenants fresh from training schools in Germany, pushed their throttles forward and dove low, too low, to evade the probing fingers of Yak-9 and La-5 fighters that patrolled the airspace, their Polikarpov engines roaring as they pounced on the lumbering transports. Some planes never even breached the lines. A Ju-52 might erupt in a fireball mid-approach, its fuselage riddled by flak shards that tore through fuel lines, sending it spiraling into the frozen Rozava River below. The crew's screams. Lost in the wind, others pressed on, only to misjudge the drop amid the confusion, their cargo canisters, painted in hasty camouflage stripes, tumbling earthward on silk parachutes that bloomed like pale flowers, only to drift on capricious winds straight into Soviet-held territory, where triumphant Red Army soldiers would whoop and scramble to claim the spoils, turning German desperation into their own bounty. From the ground, the encircled Wehrmacht troops, huddled in foxholes dug into the permafrost, their greatcoats crusted with ice and their faces gaunt from starvation, gazed upward with eyes hollowed by exhaustion and flickering with a desperate optimism. The distant drone of engines would stir them from their stupor, heads craning skyward as silhouettes emerged from the murk. And then the parachutes would descend, lazy and tantalizing, like manna from an indifferent heaven. Men would erupt from their positions, charging across no man's land in ragged sprints, their boots crunching through knee-deep snowdrifts, lungs burning in the thin, frigid air, all for the chance to seize a crate before it vanished into enemy hands. But the Soviets, ever vigilant, had anticipated this macabre dance. Their Maxim machine guns, nestled in camouflaged bunkers with belts of ammunition coiled like serpents, would open up with a staccato roar, mowing down the runners in sprays of blood that painted the snow in crimson arcs. Those few who reached a prize, dragging the heavy container back under withering fire, often uncovered a bitter irony. Instead of vital 80mm shells for the remaining park guns or tins of schmaltz to quell the gnawing void in their bellies, they might find bundles of undelivered mail from home, letters from wives and mothers scented with faint traces of perfume, now mocking relics in this frozen abyss, or crates of mismatched boots, sizes too small or too large, or obsolete spare parts for vehicles long since abandoned in the mud. The Luftwaffe's haste in packing had led to such blunders, with warehouses in the rear emptied indiscriminately, turning potential lifelines into useless ballast that only deepened the soldiers' sense of abandonment. In a bid for greater precision, some missions attempted the unthinkable, landing directly within the pocket on improvised airstrips hacked out of the steppe by exhausted engineers wielding shovels and pickaxes against the unyielding ground. These fields, little more than cleared strips amid the ruins of villages like Shenderovka or Lysyanka, were treacherous quagmires of frozen lamina, pocked with shell craters that gaped like open graves, their surfaces slick with refrozen thaw that hid treacherous ruts. A Hay-111 might approach with flaps down and engines throttled back, wheels kissing the ground, only to snap off in a screech of rending metal, the plane cartwheeling into a fiery tumble that scattered wreckage across the white expanse. Or a Condor, overloaded and sluggish, would stall. On final approach, its undercarriage collapsing into the soft earth, fuel igniting in a whoosh that engulfed the crew alive, their silhouettes writhing in the flames before stillness claimed them. The soldiers grimly nicknamed these sites Das Weiße Friedhof, the White Cemetery, where twisted aluminum husks piled up like skeletal monuments, each crash a testament to hubris and the unforgiving laws of physics. The acrid stench of burning kerosene and charred flesh would hang in the air for hours, mingling with the ever-present odor of cordite and decay, a olfactory reminder that even the machines of war were mortal. The Soviets, sensing vulnerability like predators drawn to blood, intensified their aerial hunts, deploying squadrons of Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes armored like tanks and armed with rockets that streaked toward the intruders with unerring accuracy. The skies over Cherkassy transformed into a lethal arena where dogfights unfolded in chaotic ballets of tracer fire and evasive maneuvers, the crack of cannon shells echoing across the pocket like thunderclaps. Night missions brought no respite. Under the cover of darkness, German bombers would lumber in, navigation aided by flickering pathfinder flares, only to be silhouetted against the moon or caught in the blinding beams of searchlights that pinned them like insects. A hit to an engine would send a plane into a death spiral, flames trailing like comet tails, illuminating the night in eerie orange glows that, from afar, resembled the ethereal dance of the aurora borealis, but up close revealed the horror of plummeting wreckage, the muffled thuds of impacts shaking the earth as debris rained down. Inside the pocket, the encircled men would watch these spectacles with a mix of awe and dread, murmuring half-forgotten prayers, not for tactical breakthroughs or reinforcements, but for the simplest mercies. A sip of unfrozen water from a canteen, a crust of bread to silence the hallucinations of famine, or just one more cartridge to fend off the next probe. Desperation bred atrocities that blurred the line between survival and savagery. Soldiers, their bodies wasting away to skeletal frames where ribs protruded like the bars of a cage, would crawl toward the smoldering remains of downed aircraft under the cover of night, braving sniper fire to salvage whatever could be gleaned. Twisted metal for barricades, canvas from parachutes for makeshift shelters, even the frozen remnants of crew members. Bodies hacked apart in the delirium of hunger that overrode all taboos, whispers of cannibalism circulating like ghosts among the ranks. The dead, piling up in heaps from frostbite, dysentery, and ceaseless combat, became macabre resources in this economy of extremity. Corpses stacked as windbreaks against the howling gales, their rigid forms providing insulation for dugouts where men huddled for warmth. Frozen limbs used as stepping stones across muddy trenches to avoid sinking into the mire, or even hoisted as grotesque shields during assaults. The weight of the fallen absorbing bullets meant for the living. The psychological toll was immeasurable, with men descending into catatonia, staring blankly at the horizon or muttering incoherently about home, their minds fracturing under the relentless assault on body and spirit. Yet the Luftwaffe's high command, from the opulent bunkers of the Wolf's Lair, issued promises of renewed efforts, vowing fleets that never materialized as fuel. Shortages grounded squadrons and maintenance crews battled shortages of spare parts. Weather reports worsened, with fronts of Arctic air sweeping into ground even the hardiest pilots, while Soviet air superiority grew unchallenged, their MiG-3 interceptors claiming kill after kill. Over the crackling radios in the pocket's command posts, antennas jury-rigged from scavenged wire, the terse message arrived like a death sentence. No further landings feasible. Night drops only henceforth. Hold out at all costs. Hold out! The word echoed hollowly among the officers, who relayed it to their men with forced stoicism, knowing it meant little more than prolonging the agony, breathing through one more barrage, one more night of teeth-chattering cold. In the trenches, soldiers exchanged glances heavy with unspoken truths. They were utterly isolated, forsaken by the Reich that had once promised invincibility. The skies, once a domain of German mastery with Stukas diving like eagles, now belonged to the enemy, and with each fading ember from the last crashed plane glowing faintly against the snow before succumbing to the frost, the flicker of hope dimmed, extinguished by the inexorable wind that swept over the wreckage, carrying away the last whispers of rescue into the void of the Ukrainian winter. On the morning of January 28, 1944, a deceptive silence draped the snow-dusted fields around Korsun and Cherkassy, a quiet so profound it seemed to smother the usual cacophony of war that had become the grim soundtrack of the Eastern Front. For the German and Hungarian troops of the 18th and 16th Army Corps, numbering approximately 60,000 souls, this stillness was not a reprieve, but an ominous prelude, a held breath before the plunge into an abyss. The men, scattered across the shrinking salient along the Dnieper River's bend in central Ukraine, stirred uneasily in their frost-rimed dugouts, their breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air, their eyes scanning the horizon, for signs of movement. The eerie calm shattered when reconnaissance patrols, gaunt, half-frozen figures clad in tattered greatcoats, stumbled back from their forays, their faces etched with dread, as if they had glimpsed the gates of hell itself. Their reports were unequivocal. The Soviet forces, under the relentless command of Generals Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front and Nikolai Vatutin's 2nd Ukrainian Front, had completed their encirclement. The Korsun Cherkassy Pocket, a jagged oval of contested ground roughly 30 by 20 kilometers, was sealed. What had begun as a precarious German foothold, a defiant bulge in the Soviet advance following the Wehrmacht's catastrophic defeat at Kursk, had now coalesced into a name that would echo through military history as a byword for desperation, suffering, and the inexorable grind of total war. The Korsun Cherkassy Pocket, or, as the trapped soldiers grimly dubbed it, the cauldron. The cauldron. Inside this iron ring, the remnants of once proud formations huddled together in a ragged mosaic of survival. The 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, its elite panzer grenadiers reduced to hollow-eyed spectres clutching battered MP40s, the 57th, 72nd and 389th Infantry Divisions, their ranks decimated by months of relentless attrition, and smaller contingents of Hungarian auxiliaries, conscripts thrown into the maw of a conflict far beyond their imagining, formed a disparate mass of some 56,000 Germans and 4,000 Hungarians. These were no longer cohesive units, but a patchwork of survivors, their divisions blurred by the chaos of retreat and rearguard actions, their organization fractured into ad hoc combat groups, battle groups cobbled together from whoever could still hold a rifle, officers, their peaked caps stained with mud and their voices hoarse from shouting orders over the din of artillery, struggled to maintain discipline in an environment where the chain of command was as brittle as the ice underfoot. Some resorted to barking commands with parade ground ferocity, others to pistol-point threats, knowing full well that morale teetered on the edge of collapse. The men, clad in uniforms that hung loosely on famine-wasted frames, their faces blackened by frostbite and soot, moved like automatons through a landscape of desolation, villages reduced to smoldering rubble, fields pockmarked with shell craters, and forests stripped bare by the dual ravages of war and winter. The pocket was a microcosm of defeat, a shrinking island of resistance in a sea of Soviet steel, where every man understood that their world had contracted to the few square meters of frozen earth they could still claim as their own. Beyond the perimeter, the Soviet forces tightened their grip with methodical brutality, their numbers swelling to over 200,000 men, supported by more than 500 tanks and an arsenal of artillery that seemed to defy exhaustion. The T-34 tanks, their sloped armor glistening under a sheen of frost, prowled the outer edges like predators, their 76mm guns barking in unison with the heavier thumps of IS-2 heavy tanks, whose 120 kilotewton shells could obliterate entire bunkers with a single hit. Batteries of 150mm howitzers and the dreaded Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs for their wailing salvos, formed a relentless chorus, their barrages pounding the pocket with a rhythm as steady and merciless as a heartbeat forged in iron. The Soviet commanders, emboldened by their success at Stalingrad and Kursk, orchestrated the encirclement with a precision that spoke of lessons hard learned. Infantry divisions of the 27th and 52nd Armies sealed the gaps, while mobile groups of the 5th Guards Tank Army swept around the flanks, cutting roads and rail lines like a surgeon severing arteries. Villages like Shenderovka, Lysyanka, and Novobuda fell one by one, their names scratched off German maps as Soviet sappers cleared minefields and engineers bridged the icy streams, paving the way for the next advance. From the hills surrounding the pocket, red banners fluttered defiantly, raised by Soviet scouts as both a taunt and a promise, a visual declaration that the trap was complete, its jaws snapping shut with a finality that echoed in the bones of every trapped soldier. Within the pocket, life descended into a grim calculus of survival. Supplies, already critically low after weeks of isolation, were rationed with obsessive precision. A single loaf of army bread, the dense, sawdust-laden bread that was the Wehrmacht's staple, was divided into 6 meager portions, each crumb hoarded like gold. Soldiers chewed on frozen scraps of horse meat scavenged from the carcasses of draft animals, their teeth aching from the cold and malnutrition. Water was melted from snow in rusty helmets over feeble fires, often tainted by the acrid tang of gunpowder or the coppery stench of blood that seeped into every ditch. The wounded, numbering in the thousands, faced an even bleaker fate. Field, hospitals, little more than barns or church basements strewn with straw and despair, overflowed with men writhing in agony. Without anesthesia, surgeons worked with butcher's efficiency, their saws, dulled and rusted from overuse, grinding through bone as screams echoed off the walls, blood pooling on the floor to freeze in grotesque patterns. Amputations were routine, performed with whatever tools were at hand: a hacksaw, a bayonet, or even a sharpened entrenching tool. Gangrene spread like wildfire, its sickly green hue marking men for death as surely as a bullet, and those too weak to be moved were left behind in abandoned dugouts, their comrades avoiding their pleading eyes as they retreated to the next shrinking line of defense. The Ukrainian winter, as merciless as the Soviet onslaught, became an enemy in its own right. Temperatures plunged to 20 degrees Celsius and sometimes lower. The air so cold it burned the lungs and turned exposed skin black with frostbite. Men awoke to find their boots frozen to the ground, their fingers or ears claimed by the cold overnight, the tissue necrotic and useless. Those who succumbed to exhaustion or hypothermia were found stiff as statues, their bodies stacked like cordwood to serve as makeshift windbreaks for the living, their frozen forms shielding foxholes from the biting gales that swept across the steppe. The wind itself was a tormentor, carrying shards of ice that stung like shrapnel and howled through the night, drowning out the moans of the wounded and the distant rumble of Soviet armor. Clothing offered little protection. Greatcoats, threadbare and caked with mud, failed to insulate against the chill, and many soldiers wrapped their feet in rags torn from the uniforms of the dead, their boots having long since disintegrated. The psychological toll was as brutal as the physical. Men, driven to the edge by hunger and fear, began to unravel, some staring blankly into the snow, others muttering prayers or curses, their minds retreating to memories of a Germany that seemed a lifetime away. From Berlin, the Führer's headquarters issued directives that rang hollow in the frozen wastes of the pocket, crackling over faltering radio sets. The messages were resolute, yet increasingly divorced from reality. Hold your positions at all costs. Reinforcements from the 3 Panzer Corps are en route. The Führer commands resistance, but the promises of relief, tanks from the 1st Panzer Division, or the heavy armor of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, were as insubstantial as the fog that cloaked the Dnieper. Field Marshal von Manstein, grappling with overstretched lines and dwindling reserves across Army Group South, could muster only a fraction of the forces needed to break through, and the men in the pocket knew it. Radio communications grew sporadic, the set's batteries dying in the cold, their signals drowned out by Soviet jamming that filled the airwaves with static and the ominous growl of engines massing beyond the perimeter. The encircled troops, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of signal flares, exchanged glances that spoke of a shared realization. No one was coming. The pocket was a death sentence, and the only question was how long they could delay the inevitable. The Soviet forces, emboldened by their encirclement, pressed inward with a ferocity that seemed to revel in the Germans' plight. From elevated positions on the surrounding hills, Soviet observers peered through binoculars, their breath steaming in the cold as they mapped the shrinking German positions, clusters of black dots against the white expanse, like ants trapped in a tightening noose. One officer, his greatcoat adorned with the red star, remarked with clinical detachment, "They're rats in a trap. We'll seal the hole." The metaphor was apt. The pocket was a cauldron, a Kessel, where the heat of Soviet firepower and the pressure of starvation and cold boiled the trapped men alive. Soviet tactics were unrelenting. Probing attacks tested the German lines, seeking weak points. Artillery barrages softened defenses, each shell burst sending geysers of snow and earth skyward. And tank columns, their tracks clanking ominously, rolled forward to crush strong points, their coaxial machine guns raking trenches with relentless precision. The villages within the pocket, once quaint hamlets with names like Komarovka or Kvitki, became charnel houses, their wooden houses reduced to splinters, their streets choked with the wreckage of burned-out Panzerabwehr and the frozen corpses of defenders. Inside the Kessel, the German soldiers clung to fragments of routine to stave off despair. Officers organized work details to repair fortifications, though the entrenching tools often snapped in the frozen ground. Sentries manned their posts, their Kar 98K rifles trembling in frost-numbed hands, scanning for the inevitable Soviet assault. In rare moments of respite, men shared stories of home, Bavarian villages, Berlin cafes, or the vineyards of the Rhine, though the tales grew fainter, as if memory itself were being eroded by the cold. A grizzled sergeant, his beard crusted with ice, scribbled in a tattered notebook before burning it to deny the enemy any intelligence. "We no longer fight for Germany. We fight to die standing." The words, scrawled in pencil, dulled to a stub, captured the grim resolve that had replaced hope. The men knew the only escape from the Kessel would be through a gauntlet of fire, a breakout attempt that would pit their dwindling numbers against the full might of two Soviet fronts. The red flags on the hills, fluttering like bloodstains against the grey sky, were a constant reminder that the enemy was not just outside, but all around. An omnipresent force closing in like the walls of a collapsing tomb. As the days ground on, each one a reprieve from death that felt more like a prolongation of suffering, the pocket contracted further, its boundaries marked by fresh craters and the smoldering remains of abandoned equipment. The sound of Soviet artillery became a constant, a metallic pulse that vibrated through the earth, synchronizing with the heartbeats of men who knew their time was running out. The Kessel was no longer a battlefield but a crucible, forging despair into defiance, fear into fatalism. The true inferno, the soldiers whispered among themselves, had not yet begun, but its shadow loomed, cast by the crimson banners and the relentless advance of an enemy that would not relent until the last German rifle fell silent in the snow. The fight for air and blood. Inside the pocket, time loses its meaning. Days and nights blend together between explosions, cold and smoke. With each dawn, ice covers the fallen bodies, and the ground gains a new layer of frozen blood. The men of the Wehrmacht and the SS divisions no longer fight for Hitler nor for the fatherland, fight just to see the next sunrise. The Russians completely surround the German positions, cutting off any attempt to escape. The sky, which once brought supplies, now pours only death. Soviet bombers dive in precision attacks, and Katyushas, Stalin's organs, rumble like thunder over the battlefield. Each shot launches dozens of rockets, and the impact is devastating. Men, tents, horses and vehicles are thrown into the air. The sound is so deafening that many become deaf forever. In every underground shelter, the air is heavy, smelling of sweat, blood and gunpowder. The wounded groan in the darkness, while doctors improvise bandages with rags and strips of uniforms. There is not enough morphine. The screams of the amputees echo through the night, mixed with the roars of the gunners trying to contain the Soviet waves. The Soviets advance in incessant attacks, pushing the Germans into the encirclement as if squeezing a dying animal. The Red Infantry comes in their thousands, with flags and bayonets covered by the smoke of the shots. Trenches become mass graves. The Germans fire until their guns overheat, and when they run out of bullets, they use shovels, knives their bare hands. An SS Lieutenant Wicking writes, "There are no more front lines. There are only survivors scattered among the rubble. Every house is a fortress, every tree a tomb. The cold freezes the blood in wounds before it can flow. Soldiers dig holes with their nails to protect themselves from grenades. Horses are slaughtered and turned into food. The meat is frozen and divided between groups. Some drink the blood of dead animals. It is the only liquid available. The determined Soviets attack with tanks and massed infantry, but every meter gained is expensive. The Germans resist with desperate ferocity. Dead and living mingle. Men shoot at enemies from less than 10 meters away, and when the enemy falls, the replacement appears at the same moment. The floor is covered in tank carcasses, split logs, human limbs, and pieces of burnt uniforms. The air stinks of iron and meat. A true apocalypse field. The German commanders, Schörner and Stemmermann, know that the situation is unsustainable. They look at maps and see only circles closing. Ammunition is almost out, the fuel is out, and Hitler's orders keep coming. No retreat, no step back. But orders don't feed anyone. Radios now broadcast only static and despair. Every night, the Germans see the red glow of Soviet offensives on the horizon, a blazing inferno illuminating the snow. And among the survivors, a phrase begins to spread, whispered between teeth purple with cold. Either we break through or we die here. The siege of Cherkassy is at its limit. The men are exhausted, starving, maimed. And on the horizon, the thick smoke of the Soviet advance announces that the last chance for escape is approaching. But to reach it, they will have to cross hell in full steel storm. The German reaction, Operation Wonder. As the Encircled struggle to survive in the pocket far away, outside the Soviet ring, the Isle, German generals realize the gravity of the situation. The Marshal Erich von Manstein, a brilliant and tenacious strategist, decides to act. It's not just a rescue attempt, it's a race against time and death. The plan is codenamed Operation Wonder. The goal is simple in theory, break the siege and open a corridor to Cherkassy, but the reality is brutal. The terrain is muddy, covered in snow and ice, full of craters, tank wreckage, minefields and frozen rivers. Every kilometer that relief forces advance costs precious lives. The German army organizes columns of tanks and infantry, combining panzer units with elite divisions and auxiliary troops. They advance cautiously, with observers detecting every Soviet movement. With each shot, the earth trembles, the snow turns red, and bodies fall, both Allied and enemy soldiers. Meanwhile, inside the pocket, those surrounded hear distant gunshots and explosions. Every machine gun burst that echoes through the hills gives them hope or panic. They don't know if it's the Soviets approaching or the counterattack that finally comes to their rescue. The tension is unbearable. Nerves are on edge. Every soldier asks himself, will I see the sun tomorrow? Operation Wonder is moving forward slowly, metro a metro, facing fierce resistance. The Soviets know every road, every bridge, every village. They fired mines and set up ambushes. When the German tanks appear, the crossfire greets them as if hell has gained a consciousness of its own. Inside the pocket, the surrounded soldiers begin to prepare what could be the last attack. They organize small shock units, line up the few remaining tanks, and divide up the last grenades. The plan is to break through the Soviet line simultaneously with the arrival of the rescue force. A desperate and coordinated attack, but too dangerous for any non-brave soul. Time is running out. Cold, hunger, and death surround men. With each passing minute, the siege becomes tighter, but there is still a spark. Faint, almost impossible to see, of hope. If Operation Wonder succeeds, thousands could escape the Cherkassy cauldron. If it fails, we'll all be consumed by cold, fire, and Soviet fury. And so, the two armies prepare for the most critical clash of the battle, the rescue and the desperate escape. The stage is set. White hell is about to explode in a storm of steel and blood. The awakening of horror. The battle in the corridor, end of January 1944. The sound of explosions approaches. It's Operation Wonder in action. German relief forces break through the periphery of the Soviet encirclement, but every advance is paid for in blood and steel. Tanks explode, machine guns roar, and the snow turns red with each step toward the pocket. Inside Cherkassy, the soldiers surrounded prepare for the decisive moment. They know that if they don't attack with full force at the right moment, no corridor will be opened. The wounded are carried on makeshift sleds. The last grenades and ammunition are distributed. The order is simple: attack with everything or die trying. The Soviets, noticing the movement, respond with even greater fury. The ground shakes with every artillery round and every mine explosion. The sky is covered in smoke and pieces of metal. Soldiers, living and dead, mingle in a scene that seems taken straight from hell. The tanks remaining in the pocket are pushed to exhaustion. The engines roar, smoke pours from the turrets, and they advance between craters and debris. Some end up stuck in the snow or overturned by nearby explosions, but the crew keeps firing because survival depends on it. Relief units encounter fierce resistance. The terrain, dotted with trenches and makeshift barricades, forces hand-to-hand combat. Grenades are thrown from one trench to another. Bayonets cross at a frantic pace. Blood covers uniforms, hands, faces, and weapons. The smell of gunpowder and burning flesh is omnipresent. And in the midst of this chaos, there appears the critical moment. The two armies meet in the so-called death corridor. It is a narrow space, surrounded on both sides by incessant fire. With every meter they advance, the men come across frozen corpses, wounded people begging for help, and smoking wreckage. The reality is clear. There is no room for error. For many, it is the moment when courage mixes with despair. Some soldiers shout in anger, others in fear, and the few who move forward with calculated discipline know that every step could be the last. The battle for the corridor turns into bloody choreography where tanks roar, infantry advances, mortars fire, and soldiers die side by side. The cold, hunger, and fatigue make every movement even more difficult, but the determination to get out alive is greater than any pain. The fate of the Cherkassy Pocket now depends on every soldier, every grenade, and every tank that can advance. The siege is not just an icy prison, it is an arena of extreme horror and heroism, where the line between life and death blurs every second. The corridor of hope. In the midst of the icy hell of Cherkassy, an opportunity for survival arises. The corridor to escape. Operation Wonder managed to partially break the Soviet encirclement, but the path is far from safe. It's a narrow corridor of a few kilometers, surrounded by fire on both sides, frozen snow and craters that can swallow men and vehicles. The surrounded soldiers look down the hall, a thin line between life and death. Every step requires coordination and courage. The wounded must be carried, the few tanks must clear the way, and grenades are thrown to delay the enemy. The air is filled with smoke, shrapnel, and screams. The cold gives no respite. Each gust of wind cuts through exposed skin and bones. As they advance, the soldiers realize that every meter gained costs lives. Soviet infantry launches incessant attacks trying to close the corridor. But the Germans respond with concentrated fire, firing to the last bullet, using bayonets and even their fists when there is no more ammunition. The sound is deafening. Explosions, machine gun fire, screams of pain, tank engines roaring. The snow, once white, is now tinged with dark red. The fallen bodies are used to reinforce makeshift barricades and protect survivors. For many soldiers, the hallway is a promise of life that seems impossible to achieve. They run, crawl, stumble, and get up again, determined to get through that hell. The German leadership does its best to maintain order, but chaos is absolute. Outside, relief tanks and infantry continue to advance, clearing the way and holding back the enemy. Every advance is celebrated, but every loss is felt deeply. The runner becomes a mixture of partial victory and human tragedy. At the end of the day, some groups of soldiers manage to cross the corridor. Wounded, exhausted, covered in blood and ice, they look back and see the pocket being slowly destroyed by Soviet fire. For those who escape, it is a bitter victory. For those who stayed, death or capture is inevitable. The corridor of hope is narrow, bloody and treacherous, but it represents the last chance of survival for those who still breathe inside the hell of Cherkassy. Escape is possible, but every step forward is a dance with death. With the corridor partially open, the most critical moment of the battle arrives, the complete breaking of the siege. The surrounded soldiers know there is no time to waste. Cold, hunger, and injuries push them to the brink of madness. The only way out is to cross the Soviet ring or perish there. The plan is simple in theory, but deadly in practice. Tanks advance forward to clear the way. Infantry follows behind, shooting and throwing grenades to hold off the Soviets. The wounded and the weakest are transported on improvised sleds. The attack begins at dawn, under a grey, snowy sky. The roar of Soviet artillery explodes around the corridor, but the Germans advance. Each step is a mixture of courage and desperation. Explosions throw up columns of snow and debris. Men fall, some killed instantly, others injured, dragged by their colleagues. The corridor becomes a true catwalk of death. The ground is covered in bodies, destroyed tanks and debris. Soldiers have to jump over craters and corpses, firing as they go, no time for fear or hesitation. Despite huge losses, the advance continues. Officers shout orders, trying to maintain discipline, while infantry fight just meters away. The Soviets try to close the corridor, launching coordinated attacks, but the Germans hold firm. Every meter conquered a bloody victory. At some points, the soldiers find themselves surrounded on small islands of survival, facing fire from three sides. This is where individual courage shines. Soldiers shoot until they have no bullets left. They use bayonets, stones, anything they can grab. The air fills with smoke, ice, blood, and screams. Absolute chaos. After hours of intense combat, the corridor remains open. The most organized groups manage to cross and find reinforcements from Operation Wonder. But victory comes at a monstrous price. Thousands of dead scattered across the snow, hundreds of seriously injured, destroyed tanks, and a collective feeling that every step was won with blood, not glory. What remained of the Ex-Schied and Ex-Vertreter Army Corps now finds itself outside the pocket, but deeply marked. Survivors carry on their faces, hands, and minds the images of Cherkassy hell. The escape was possible, but the battle left scars that would never be erased. And the war continues. But for many there, the real battle is over, and they survived the impossible. The desperate breakup, the encirclement of Cherkassy, was the most critical moment of the battle. With the corridor partially open, the encircled soldiers advanced in extreme cold, hunger and wounds, using tanks in front, infantry firing and grenade throwing to hold back the Soviets, and the wounded transported on makeshift sleds. Explosions, corpses and debris turned the path into a catwalk of death, and every meter gained cost lives and blood. After hours of fighting, the corridor remained open, allowing the most organized groups to reach Operation Wonder reinforcements. But the price was monstrous. Thousands dead, hundreds seriously injured, and tanks destroyed. When the dust settled, the horror of losses, it became clear. Of the approximately 60,000 encircled, only 25,000 escaped. The scene was devastating, with bodies covered in snow, burned tanks, torn uniforms, destroyed weapons, and an air heavy with gunpowder and blood. The survivors, exhausted and wounded, bore deep physical and psychological trauma. Cherkassy became a symbol of the brutality of war on the Eastern Front, showing the depths of blind obedience and fanaticism that can take an army. While the Germans paid a heavy price, the Soviets also suffered heavy losses, but they held supplies and ground, consolidating their strategic position. Cherkassy was not just a battle, it was a frozen nightmare, where each day was a fight for survival against the enemy, the cold, hunger and destruction becoming one of the bloodiest and most desperate episodes of the Second World War. And even those who escaped carry forever the weight of memories of white hell, where every meter conquered was bought with blood. The finally opened corridor allowed the survivors to escape the pocket, but the Battle of Cherkassy left deep scars. More than half of the encircled soldiers died of cold, hunger, or wounds, and the few remaining tanks and vehicles were unable to save anyone. The survivors carry traumatic memories of lost friends, destroyed villages, and a landscape of unprecedented destruction. Despite the suffering, the battle demonstrated the strength of hope and human determination. Surrounded and exhausted, the soldiers organized a coordinated breakout, fighting to the limit to break through the Soviet ring, thanks to the discipline, courage, and planning of Operation Wonder. For the Soviets, the victory consolidated their strategic position in Ukraine, but it also cost thousands of lives. Cherkassy symbolizes the brutality of the Eastern Front, highlighting the futility of irrational orders, the horrors of the Russian winter, and the desperate resistance of trapped men. The survivors returned as maimed heroes, while the Kessel remains a grim reminder of the war, an extreme struggle for survival marked by courage, suffering, and the direct experience of death.